Hi everyone, welcome back to my little foundation sewing series. In part 1, we learned about sewing machine basics. Part 2, we covered beginner-friendly fabric and tools. Today, it's a very important step. It's all about reading and cutting a sewing pattern. This is the step where a lot of beginner sewers start to feel intimidated, but I promise you it's not as complicated as it looks. Once you understand a few key things, everything becomes so much clearer. In this video, I'll walk you through how to print, tile, and prepare a PDF pattern, how to read the information in your pattern, understanding seam allowances and notches, how to lay out your fabric correctly, how to pin or weigh down your pattern pieces, and finally, a few cutting tips so everything runs smoothly. So if you're planning to start your first sewing project or you want to follow along to my beginner sewing series, which is coming very soon, this video will help set you up for success and make everything feel so much more fun and manageable. All right, let's get into it. The first step is preparing your pattern. Now, most modern sewing companies will have a printable PDF pattern, which means you print it at home and then you tape the pages together. So for today's tutorial, I'm using a pattern from Style Arc. I really like their patterns. I think they're well thought through, they're detailed, and the instructions are nice and clear. Because I'm a new pattern company, I don't quite have a pattern that's like detailed enough of my own to share for this video yet. So now let's go to the computer and print the pattern. When you open the pattern file, look for the test square. This is really important because we need to make sure the pattern is printed to the correct scale. Before printing the entire pattern, print just that page. Check that your printer settings are set to actual size or 100% scale. And don't use fit to page because that can change the size of the pattern. Measure the test square with a ruler. The test square should match the measurement listed on the page. So this one is 10 centimeters by 10. And then if correct, print the rest of the pattern. After printing, we need to tile the pages together. So each page has a border and markings that show you how the pages line up. Sometimes there's also a diagram showing an overview of the tiled pages, which is very handy. For this example, the pages are numbered clearly and you match the little numbered triangles together. I like to trim the margins off one side of each page and then overlap them. So you can do whatever method suits you. The goal is simply to line up the markings accurately so that your pattern pieces match. Take the pages together until the full pattern sheet is assembled and only tape where the pattern lines are. And a little tip, you don't always have to tape all the pages together, so some pattern pieces only need a few edges taped to make the full shape. Now it's assembled, we need to cut the correct size out. Most patterns are multi-sized. You'll see the cutting lines for different sizes. So in the instructions or on the website, check the size chart to determine your pattern size. So for this brand, I'm a size 10 based on their measurement chart. On this pattern, I can see that light blue is size 10. Sometimes pattern companies will differentiate the sizing with colors or different dashed or dotted line designs. Some pattern pieces are one size, which means they're not graded and are used across all sizes, like this pocket bag. Once you've found your size, cut along that line. So in this pattern, I'm cutting along the solid line, not the dashed line. The solid line is the outer edge of the pattern piece and the dashed line shows the seam line where you sew. So let's quickly do that now. And that's the pattern cut out. So this stage is quite time consuming, but once you've tiled it, you can obviously reuse this pattern again and again. Let's talk about what you're actually looking at when you see a pattern piece. A very important marking is the grain line. This is usually shown as a long arrow on the pattern piece, and it tells you how the piece should be aligned with the direction of the fabric. We'll talk more about this when we get to fabric layout. Some pattern pieces are cut as one pair, which means you flip the pattern piece when cutting. So because of that, you need to see the grain line on both sides. I like to hold the pattern up to the window and use the light to trace the grain line onto the other side. And that way, when you're cutting, you can easily flip the pattern pieces around and arrange them on the fabric. Two other markings you'll often see are seam allowances and notches. The seam allowance is a distance between the edge of the fabric and the line where the seam is actually sewn. On this pocket bag, there is a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch along these edges, but on this edge, it's a 6 millimetre or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now for notches. These are small triangle or line markings along the edges of pattern pieces, and there will be lots of them. On my patterns, I like to cut out little triangles for my notches, so if you do this, don't cut too deep. They shouldn't extend past the sewing line. Notches are really important. They act like little guides that help everything match up correctly. They might indicate things like a fold line, a change in seam allowance, or show how different pieces line up when you sew them together. We can see here the centre back notch on the waistband will match the centre back seam on the shorts. Then this notch will match the back dart. And finally, this notch indicates the side seam. Oh, and one more thing, you may see what are called drill holes. On this pattern, there's one here marking the dart. You can make a small hole with something sharp or the tip of your scissors. Now let's look at the key pieces of information on the pattern. The style name, Braxton woven short, the size range, sizes 10 to 22, the piece name, and the cutting information. The piece name tells you what the piece is. The cutting instructions tell you how many pieces to cut and what fabric to cut them from. Let's quickly go through some of the most common terms. Main refers to the main fabric of your garment. Contrast refers to a second fabric in your garment. Lining is the inside lining layer. Fusing or interfacing, this is a lightweight material with glue on one side that's ironed onto fabric to help stabilize areas like collars, waistbands, or button plackets. Block fuse, it means you fuse the fabric first and then you cut it. Placement fuse means you cut the fusing separate to the fabric and then you place it on and fuse it together. Cut one is literally cut one piece. Cut two is the same as just cut two pieces. Cut one pair means you cut one piece and then you flip the pattern over and you cut the mirrored piece. Cut one RSU, meaning right side up. So you don't flip this pattern over and cut it. So it's often used for asymmetric pieces. So this fly facing is cut one right side up. Cut on fold. This means the edge of the pattern piece should be placed along the folded edge of the fabric. So the right side of the fabric is on the inside. And sometimes you need to mark the notches along the fold line. Your pattern will also tell you how much fabric to buy and what trims you need. So the fabric requirements are dependent on the width of your fabric. So with your pattern size in mind, always look at the chart to see how much fabric you need. My fabric's cuttable width is 148 centimeters and I'm a size 10. So this chart says I need 1.3 meters of fabric or 1.4 yards. It also tells me fabric suggestions and the trims or notions I need for sewing the shorts. Most patterns include a layout diagram showing you how to arrange the patterns on the fabric. Let's take a look at it and see how it works in practice. For this example, for my fabric, I can follow this lay plan, which is for 148 centimeter wide fabric. There's also another layout option for fabric with 112 centimeters. So if you've got a narrower fabric, you can follow this one. So it shows one fold and two salvages. You can see the right side is on the inside and we've got the grain lines of all of the pattern pieces aligning with the salvages. So let's do this one now. First, you need a space where you can lay your fabric out. Start by making sure one salvage edge of the fabric is straight and laying flat. So I like to align it with the edge of the table, but any straight line will work. Fold your fabric in half with the right sides facing each other. If you missed this in the Foundations 2 video, here's a quick tip for identifying the right side. Look at the little puncture holes along the selvage. The smooth side usually indicates the right side of the fabric. Align your two salvages together. There should be no twisting or pulling in your fabric. If there is, try lifting the fabric and folding again. Ideally, the weft grain of the fabric, the horizontal grain, should sit at a right angle to the selvage. But because of the manufacturing process, this isn't always perfectly straight. The most important thing is making sure your salvages are aligned correctly and try to keep the fabric line as flat and smooth as possible. Now follow the instructions on each pattern piece along with a layout diagram to place your pieces on the fabric. The grain line on the pattern should run straight and parallel with the edge of your table or whatever you're using as your straight reference. For now, I'm just laying the pieces out roughly to make sure everything fits, and I'll straighten them up in a moment. And remember, you don't have to follow the layout exactly, so if you see a better way to use your fabric more efficiently, go for it. And I'm sort of doing that here. I'm only laying out the pattern pieces that are cut in the main fabric. These are the pieces that are fused, so I'll show you how we do these after the main. Once your pattern is laid out, it's time to secure the pattern pieces so they don't move when we cut. You'll need your tape measure now so we can make sure the grain lines are nice and straight as we go. The most common method for securing pattern pieces is pins. And another option is pattern weights. So these are simply placed on top of your pattern pieces and they hold them in place. I personally prefer this option. I think they're so much faster and easier to use, but pins work perfectly fine, especially if you're a beginner sewer. So I'm going to show you now how to use these two options. First, let's get the grain line straight with the edge of the table. I like to measure at a few different points along the grain line to make sure it's properly aligned. Now, if you're using pins, hold your pattern firmly in place and pin through all the layers. I usually pin the corners and along any long seam lines, basically just enough to hold everything in place so the fabric doesn't shift while cutting. I'll pin a few pattern pieces down now to show you. If you prefer using pattern weights, you'll need something to mark around your pattern. I use a heat erasable pen. Honestly, I use this every time I sew. I've linked it in the description below. Tailor's chalk or even a light pencil works too. Again, start by aligning your grain lines, then place your weights on top of the pattern pieces. These just sit on the pattern to keep it flat against the fabric while you trace around it. Make sure you mark all of the notches as well. These are really important. And any drill holes like this dart here, make sure you mark those too. And just to quickly show you, this little piece is actually cut on the bias, which means the grain line runs at a 45-degree angle. So to position it, just align the grain line on the pattern with the straight selvage edge of your fabric like normal. If you're cutting on the fold, I like to add a couple of pins to stop the layers from shifting while cutting. You can also keep using your pattern weights, and if you're cutting single layer, then of course you don't need to worry about that. Now we're ready to cut, but before you start, use sharp scissors that are only used for fabric. There is nothing more frustrating than using blunt scissors to try cut fabric. Cut slowly and carefully along the pattern lines. So try to keep the fabric flat on the table while you cut rather than lifting it up, which can distort the shape. When you reach a notch, make a small clip into the seam allowance. Just make sure the clip stays within the seam allowance and it's not too deep. Once everything's cut, it helps to keep things organized. Remove the pins and then pair pieces right side together and keep them grouped neatly. For the dart drill hole, we'll need to transfer that marking to the matching piece. So just push a pin through the hole and mark it on the other layer. This piece was cut as a pair, but it's actually meant to be cut as a single piece. So remove the extra layer and make sure you keep the correct one. I like to mark the wrong side of the fabric so I don't get confused later. Now that's the main pieces all bundled together. I want to show you the fused pieces. Here's a close look at the fusing. You can see the glue on one side of the fabric. Now you have two options for fusing, placement fusing or block fusing. Let's start with placement fusing. With this method, you cut your pattern piece out of the fusing first. If your fusing has a grain line marked on it, make sure you follow that as well. Personally, I find placement fusing works well for sturdy fabrics that won't shift while pressing, and it also reduces waste since you're only using fusing where you need it. Once your piece is cut, place the fusing onto the wrong side of your fabric with the glue side facing down and press them together. Make sure you're only using dry heat, no steam, because steam can sometimes cause the glue to lift later on. The other option is block fusing, which works well for lightweight fabrics that tend to move around. So instead of cutting first, you fuse a larger block of fabric and interfacing together, and then you cut your pattern pieces from that, and it keeps everything stable before cutting. I usually estimate a block large enough to fit all the fused pieces, but you can also work in smaller blocks if that's easier to handle. Just fuse it under the iron using dry heat. Once the fabric and fusing are bonded together, you can cut out your pieces as normal, making sure your grain lines are straight as you go. And once all your fusing is done, just add those pieces to your cut bundle and you're ready to start sewing. And that's the basic process of reading and cutting a sewing pattern. It might seem like a lot of steps at first, but once you've done it a few times, it just becomes second nature. And it's actually really important to take a little bit of extra care at this stage because it makes everything run so much smoother later on. If you're planning to follow along to my beginner sewing series, these foundation skills will help make you feel so much more confident and ready to go. And if you found this video helpful, please subscribe, and that way you don't miss the free bag, hat, and dress pattern when they launch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.